It's now time for Party Chat Sports.
The only thing else I got to say is, how about them Cowboys?
Hey, what's up, Party Chat Sports? Just one of your hosts, Caleb Gill, and welcome to the first episode of the series of Jets Misfortunes. This has been a little, kind of a long time, not quite a long time. It's been brewing for a little bit. We've teased it a few times. It's been talked about, and I'm finally sitting down to start the first episode of the series of Jets Misfortunes. And this is probably going to be about a 5-episode series or so, I'd say. And it's going to cover 2023 NFL season, of course. We'll talk about how this past season went for the Jets. And, you know, if you listen to me, if you follow anything that I've said, either on Twitter, on our pods, you'll know how I feel about the season and how everything transpired. But we'll talk more in depth about the 2023 NFL season. And then we'll get into some actual people and their tenures with the Jets. So, like the general manager, Joe Douglas, the head coach, Robert Saleh, former first round draft pick, second overall, Zach Wilson. We'll talk about his tenure with the Jets. We'll talk about the longest playoff drought in Major League Sports. We're on the baker's dozen there. And we'll also discuss the future, what the future holds, get into some offseason topics as well, what the Jets should do. Will they do it? We'll see how everything transpires and unfolds, but that's my plan at the moment for this series of Jets Misfortunes. And like I already said, today we're going to discuss the 2023 NFL season. On paper, it looks fine. You look at the Jets going 7-10 with all the injuries they had, some very notable injuries, yes, of course. And you look and it's like, wow, they actually still managed to go 7-10. That looks pretty good. But for those of us that actually watch the games, follow the Jets religiously, it felt like a lot more than 7 wins. Like it felt a lot more than 10 losses, I should say. It felt like we lost a lot more, which, yes, in some areas we did lose a lot more than, just those 10 wins show, but there was a lot of question marks throughout the year. I think the first thing that we really have to ask ourselves, though, is the first thing when discussing how we got here, I think you can really say the Jets season was over 4 plays in. Dylan, Drew, I don't know if Cam's made as many comments, but I know definitely Dylan and Drew. Dylan more so than Drew, but they have said about how the season was over after 4 plays. I think you can take it a step further than that. I think the season might have been over well before it started. I think the Jets put themselves in a big hole early. And this is one thing that the Jets have a tendency to do, where they claim to go all in, but then you really get into the nitty-gritty, and they really don't. Their biggest issue, I think, from an organizational standpoint, which haunted them throughout this entire season, was a lack of plan B. I made a comment a couple weeks ago, but I think it still stands, where they're all in on plan A, but once plan B comes around, or the need for a plan B arrives, they're not willing to fork up the $50. They're not going to pay for plan B. It is what it is, right? They're not going to pay for plan B. They're just going to deal with the consequences if they get to that point. They expect plan A to work to the fullest, which, I mean, when you come up with a plan and you come up with anything, you expect plan A to work. That's why it's the first plan. You expect that to work. But this is real life, right? This isn't Madden where you can turn injuries off. if you so choose. This is real life. These are real people who get injured. You have to plan accordingly, and the Jets consistently fail to do so. So let's talk about that Aaron Rodgers situation first, because that's kind of the trickle down. Like, you have the Aaron Rodgers effect, and it just kind of all trickles down into how we got here. The Jets make it very known that they want Aaron Rodgers, and they're going to go after Aaron Rodgers. They go get his offensive coordinator, which the whole coaching staff on the offensive side was a mess this year. Offensive coordinator Nathaniel Hackett, run or pass game coordinator Todd Downing, whatever his role is, he sucks. Keith Carter, one of the worst offensive line coaches in the league, he was terrible. So the offensive coaching staff was a mess. But that's kind of what happens when you have a situation like the Jets did, where they had to win, or it seemed like heading into the 2023 season they had to win, or else they were all going to get canned. And so it makes the job not attractive at all. And then you bring in Nathaniel Hackett, who just had a horrible run in Denver, gets fired, doesn't even get through his first season as an NFL head coach, gets fired, let go. Sean Payton then comes in, blasting that coaching staff, saying it was one of the worst one of the worst coaching jobs ever for the Broncos last year. But Nathaniel Hackett comes in because the Jets plan to go after Aaron Rodgers. I think this is the first sign of, the negative things to come. The Jets went all in on Aaron Rodgers. I mentioned they don't have a plan B. I was thinking about this earlier. What would have the Jets' plan B been? They didn't have one. They expected only to get Aaron Rodgers. They passed up on Derek Carr, Jimmy Garoppolo, which I was fine with that at the time. I didn't want those guys in New York at the time. I'm fine with passing up on those guys. Better off without them. Still, for the most part, with the way those contracts are structured, I'm fine with passing up on those guys. But still, what would the Jets have done had the Packers been like, you know what? We see you going to parties. The general manager got drunk, went to a fan event, and said Aaron Rodgers is coming.
Aaron Rodgers, when's he coming? He's gonna be here.
This was a month before the trade was official, by the way. The team got cocky and arrogant, which is another issue with this team that we'll get into here in a little bit. But plan B, there was no plan B for quarterback. Had Aaron Rodgers changed his mind last minute, had the Packers said, you know what, we're going to go in a different direction. We're going to trade him to a team that actually is taking us seriously. They never planned for anything after Aaron Rodgers. It worked out for them that they got Aaron Rodgers, at the time, because they didn't have to worry about a plan B, but there was no plan B. And then let's start getting to, I'm going to mention plan A's and plan B's a lot, because that is a huge thing that's sticking out to me with this 2023 season. You get to the NFL draft. And the first issue with the draft is that you gave up more than you had to. Like, why did you pick swap in the first round with the Green Bay Packers? That makes no sense to me. You didn't have to do that. The Packers really, it's not like they would have missed out on taking Lucas Van Ness had they stayed at 15 instead of moving up to 13. What it did was put the Jets in a spot to where instead of being in front of New England, they were now behind New England, which you knew the Patriots were going to do something to screw the Jets over, and that's exactly what they did. And heading into the draft, again, everybody knew the Jets were going to take a tackle. It was probably going to be Broderick Jones. And who was there at 13 had the Jets would have stayed there at 13? Broderick Jones. Who was there at 14? When the Patriots were like, you know what, we can screw over the Jets. Steelers come up, get your offensive tackle right in front of New York, Broderick Jones. And at 15, yeah, it sucks you missed out on the offensive tackle. But there was still some good weapons available. It was, I was pounding hard for Jackson Smith and Jigba. But had you drafted a Zay Flowers, a Jordan Addison, Had you drafted a wide receiver, I think that this season would have looked a little bit different, and you'd be going into this offseason thinking a little bit better about your offense. But you panic. You take a player at a position that you don't need in Will McDonald. I was not a fan of the pick at the time. I think the player's going to be fine. I like the player. I don't like the pick. I think it's a poor use of assets. And we're going to get into a lot of draft stuff, like just draft history with Joe Douglas in the next episode of this series of Jets Misfortunes, but just poor use of draft picks there. Why aren't you... What was your plan B? First of all, your plan B was to take an edge rusher earlier than people thought you should have gone? That was your plan B if you missed out on Roderick Jones. Just terrible execution there. And the Jets didn't even address offensive tackle. We'll get to that one in a second. So where else did the Jets have a plan A and neglect to execute a plan B? I think the Odell Beckham thing is a very big example. The drafting of Will McDonald when Roderick Jones was gone right in front of him. That's huge. The Odell Beckham thing blows my mind. The Jets really wanted OBJ. They thought they had him. Like, OBJ went on somebody's podcast recently and said that the Jets were pretty much saying, like, they had the understanding and the belief that they were getting OBJ. And that it was a privilege for OBJ to come to New York. What have the Jets done in the last decade, to make it a privilege for anybody to go to New York if you have options? They haven't done anything. They haven't won in 13 years. The arrogance of this team, the stubbornness of this team never ceases to amaze me. They miss out on OBJ. DeAndre Hopkins was available. They're like, you know what? We're good. We don't need to upgrade at wide. If OBJ doesn't want to come here, we don't need to upgrade. We'll allocate those dollars to Dalvin Cook. That worked out great, by the way. Here's another one that really bothers me. Not only did they fail to get OBJ, which I'm fine. I'm not saying I wanted OBJ. But the Jets were telling us that they needed or wanted a wide receiver. That they felt they needed an upgrade. Keep in mind, Corey Davis was still on the roster. After OBJ decides, you know what, I'm going to go to Baltimore, they're like, we're good. And then the Jets get to training camp, and Corey Davis retires. This is one that is not talked about nearly enough. This is an issue that faced the Jets this season. Myself included. Didn't talk about this nearly enough. But Corey Davis, up and retiring, sucked. You want to know how bad Allen Lazard is? I was missing Corey Davis hard this year. That's how bad Allen Lazard was. Corey Davis's presence was missed. In the locker room, in that wide receiver room. Yeah, Corey Davis had issues with drops, but you could trust him in the clutch. Not that the Jets had many, times where they were in those clutch situations, but I'm thinking like Vegas, against the Raiders on Sunday Night Football. Zach Wilson throws a beautiful no-look pass, and Allen Lazard is like, oops, I forgot how to catch today. Corey Davis would have been nice there. And the Jets went into training camp thinking their wide receiver room was going to look like Garrett Wilson, dog, by the way, Corey Davis, Allen Lazard, who we just paid big money to, McCole Hardman. I was telling a lot of people I liked Garrett Wilson as the 1, Lazard as a 3, and McCole Hardman as a 4. Corey Davis, I wanted another wide receiver in place of. I grew to be fine with it. And then he leaves. So that leaves Wilson, Lazard, Hardman. I can't really move that thing without the other. Anyways. So your number 2, or your number 3, now becomes a 2. and your 4 now becomes a 3 because they never replaced the 1 or that 2. Really, you thought I was going to leave that finger up, didn't you? You thought. They never replaced Corey Davis. They just bumped everybody else up the depth chart and said, you know what, we're good, status quo. The whole status quo mantra of the Jets. They don't plan accordingly. DeAndre Hopkins was available. That's who I wanted. And I got called greedy by certain people in this group, someone in this group, for wanting DeAndre Hopkins. He ended up having a good year in Tennessee. He would have been really good next to Garrett Wilson. He would have made the quarterback's life easier. Yeah, quarterback play sucked this year. It would have been made a lot easier if there was somebody else outside of Garrett Wilson that they could rely on catching the ball. Would have been a lot easier. And Lazard never showed that. McCole Hardman ended up getting traded. So you finished the year relying on 2 undrafted free agents. There was no plan B at wide receiver. The Jets went in with the all-in mindset, but it really was just all in on the headlines, in the media, like on the newspaper articles. Like, if you really look at how the Jets attacked an all-in year, they didn't attack it at all. They got Aaron Rodgers. What else did they do? They brought in Nathaniel Hackett, Aaron Rodgers' buddy. They brought in Alan Lazard, an old receiver of Aaron Rodgers. They brought in McCole Hardman. They brought in Billy Turner to be your swing tackle, also played with Rodgers. They didn't. Nothing the Jets did this last offseason tells me they actually went all in. Because again, stubbornness. Self-evaluation is just a skill the Jets lack. They don't know how to self-evaluate themselves. And that was shown clear as day. Because they looked at this roster and said, you know what, Aaron Rodgers wants to come here as is. It's good enough. It's good enough. With Aaron Rodgers, you can make it to the playoffs. As a roster is. But you bring in Aaron Rodgers to be a Super Bowl team. This team doesn't tell me it doesn't look like a Super Bowl team. That's how they went in. That's how they went through the offseason. And then that's where we get to the final act of Plan A not working. When Aaron Rodgers goes down. 4 plays in. Broke my heart. That sucked. That was awful. But what was the plan B? You traded for a 39, 40-year-old quarterback who had injuries in 2022. What was your plan B at quarterback? Zach Wilson, who you publicly were trying to get rid of and replace? And then Aaron Rodgers comes in and... Look, I was all for 2023 being a redshirt year for Zach Wilson. Learning under Aaron Rodgers, if he was going to succeed, that was his best chance to do so. A redshirt year does not mean you are an Aaron Rodgers Achilles injury away from taking meaningful snaps. He should have been the emergency quarterback at best. He should have been 3 on the depth chart. But no, they brought in Tim Boyle. What the Jets did this year was they went out, they bought a $60,000 used car. Beautiful car. Loved it. But they got state minimum insurance on it. Said, you know what? We're fine. We don't need to pay for the extra insurance. We're not going to get full coverage or anything like that, even though we just dropped a boatload of money on this car. And then a week after driving it, the engine blows. And you're like, oh shit. Now what? Should have gotten full coverage. You should have gotten better insurance. You should have planned better. You can't tell me going into the season, anyone with any rational thought, I did not have rational thought, by the way, thought that this could actually work the way the Jets looked. heading into that week one. I mean, your week one starter, or your starting lineups, they failed to get an offensive tackle. They wanted to draft one in the first round. They didn't. What they do? They put out a 40-year-old left tackle who had some sort of shoulder surgery or something. They put a 40-year-old left tackle, a left guard who they paid a boatload of money to, but has been a huge disappointment so far. A center that they were trying to replace. They drafted his replacement in the second round. A right guard, Elijah Vera Tucker. Love that dude, but he was coming off of a triceps injury. And then a right tackle, in Mekhi Becton, who had played, heading into this year, one snap, or one game in the last 2 years. He started against Carolina in 2021. Played 3 quarters of that game before getting hurt, out for the year. Last year, Mekhi Becton's out for the entire year, gets hurt in training camp. That's your starting offensive line. They did nothing to upgrade. They didn't add anybody. They didn't add a new starter. Nothing. They said, you know what? We're good. Because as long as our starting 5 don't get hurt, this team doesn't account for injuries. Again, like I said earlier, this isn't Madden. You can't turn the injury sliders off. This is real life. And the Jets went through a boatload of injuries out offensive line. But your 5 weren't that great to begin with. So a lot of my issues with the Jets this year is how they went into week 1. How they approached the offseason. I think they were doomed from the start because they didn't take this seriously, or seriously enough. And then let's look at actually the games this year. I talked a lot about, heading into the season, week 1 and whatnot. So week 1 against the Bills, overtime, Rodgers gets hurt. The Jets come back and win. Xavier Gibson gets a game-winning touchdown on a punt return. Beautiful. Then they go to Dallas. I'm going to move this. They go to Dallas, get blown out in the second half. It was close. If Sauce Gardner picks off Dak, takes it to the house, it might be a different game. I don't know. But the Jets get blown out in the second half in Jerry World. Belichick always has Zach Wilson's number. They lose. They start the season 1-4 after losing Sunday Night Football against the Chiefs. 23-20, close game. Jets probably should have won that game, but they didn't. And the entire year, they kept looking back. This is an issue I have with this organization, with this coaching staff, and everybody else to begin with, is that they look at one game and say, if we can replicate that, we can replicate that. When are you going to replicate that? The Jets failed to replicate that game, that script, that play for most of the year, seemingly. They lose to Kansas City. They do get the win next week in Denver, 31-21 in the House of Horrors, as Elijah Vera Tucker gets her for a second straight year in Denver. I hope he never has to play in Denver again. But that's because Breece Hall is just a beast. He goes for 177 yards on the ground. Then they get a win against the Eagles. The Eagles pretty much beat themselves. Jalen Hurts had 3 interceptions. That was four turnovers total. The Eagles beat themselves. But you go into the bye week 3-3. And it's like, all right, we fix this. If we can add this, just make some, even just roster adjustments or just the way they call games. You didn't have to go add. Would have been nice if the Jets added a player like Urza Cleveland from the Vikings. Would have been nice. They didn't. Okay. The Jets should have. They made no adjustments, no changes, and said, you know what? We just won 2 games. Status quo. That's what Salah should get as his next shirt, is status quo. Because he likes all of his slogans. They play the Giants 13-10, and Jets fans, we all know this. We should have lost that game. Should have lost it. The funniest thing about that is that we should have lost it, even though we gave up negative passing yards. But Breece Hall, man. Breece Hall, bless his heart. Love that dude. They get blown out on Monday Night Football. They no-show in Monday Night Football at home against the Chargers, 27-6. They really don't show up against the Raiders. They lose 16-12. Had a chance at the end on a Hail Mary that Zach Wilson almost made complete, but Tyler Conklin decided, you know what, I'm going to punch this ball away from Garrett Wilson. And yeah, he sold. No run game, no help there. They no-show in Buffalo, 32-6. They no-show on Black Friday against the Dolphins, 34-13. They really no-show against the Falcons in a 13-8 loss. They beat the Texans 30-6, which is just a weird game. That you'll get that every so often in the NFL, just weird games out of nowhere. It's like, how the hell that happened? Zach Wilson just had his best game ever? Really? For real? It was 0-0 at the half, too. I'll never understand that game. That'll never make sense to me. And then they follow that up with 0 points against the Dolphins. Also, no-show. 30-0 loss against the Dolphins. They really should have lost to the Commanders had Jacoby Brissett started the game or been inserted into the game earlier. They would have lost to the Commanders, ended up getting a win 30-28. They no-show against the Browns in Cleveland, 37-20 on Thursday Night Football. And then they beat the Patriots. Breece Hall beats the Patriots 17-3, sending Bill Belichick out with a loss in Foxborough. So that does feel nice looking back. But the season ended. So they, after the bye week, they go 4-7 after the bye. But they started 1-5 after the bye. And that's where, like, the season was still there. Like, the entire year you had... I never bought into it. Anybody that I've talked to knows I never bought into the Aaron Rodgers coming back hype this year. Never bought into it, never thought it was happening. But the players seemed to buy into it, or they should have bought into it a little bit more, I think. There were rumblings, there was rumors, he was back out practicing. And yet, come game day, it didn't look like the Jets had anything to play for. I think that's a huge testament on the coaching staff. The no-shows is what really bothers me. Blown out against the Cowboys. Blown out against the Chargers. Blown out against the Bills. Blown out against the Dolphins twice. Blown out against the Browns. Like, the way the Jets overestimated themselves this year, heading into this year and throughout the season, blows my mind. And even, like, they no-show against the Dolphins in Miami. Aaron Rodgers on the sideline, and it's like, you know what? The next week was when Aaron Rodgers was hoping to be back against the Commanders. So you have at Miami, then home against the Commanders. If they beat the Dolphins, there's something to play for. So Aaron Rodgers might come back. And they don't show up. I don't know. I have a lot of issues with this team, this coaching staff, this regime in general. And I really don't know if that does summarize the 2023 season all that well. But my big takeaway from this year is they overestimated everything. They couldn't seem to get out of their own way. And they were in playoff contention for a while. And while in playoff contention, they decided, you know what, we're good. It wasn't until they were out of playoff contention, like really out of playoff contention, that they decided to show up there at the end of the year. Had a couple wins that don't matter. Just look good on the stat sheet. Makes Robert Saleh even in terms of total wins and total losses by double-digit points. It's 18 total, by the way, for both. So, this team, man, I don't get it. But the 2023 season was over before it started, because they didn't approach it correctly during the offseason. They said, Aaron Rodgers, you're coming here. That's our plan A. Plan B, not forking up the $50. We're good. We'll deal with the consequences. And sure as shit, they did. We'll see how it goes moving forward. I will say this, not to be depressing or anything, but I went into this season with so much anticipation, so much excitement. And this year was a big reminder as to why I shouldn't as a Jets fan. Jets fans, you understand it. You get it. So I've vowed to not be that fan that gets overexcited and thinks everything the Jets do is perfect and fine and la la land until the Jets show wins on the field. I'm going to say this now. As we're finished recapping the 2023 season, my expectations for 2024, 9-8, edge into the wild card, and they lose. They don't show up in the wild card, essentially, is my expectation. That's what I'm thinking is going to happen. We'll see how everything does work out for the Jets next season. But if 2023 is any indication of how things work or will play out, yeah, they'd probably make the playoffs with Aaron Rodgers. Do they win anything of substance in the playoffs with Aaron Rodgers? I don't think so. So I know I'm just kind of rambling, but just to recap, 2023 was over before it started. That's how we got here. And let's wrap it up. Next week, we will dive into Joe Douglas, his tenure, his draft record, his free agency, everything that most of what Joe Douglas has done as general manager of the New York Jets. And even though, at the surface, it looks pretty, when you really start digging, it's crap. It's not good. We'll get into that next week. Until then, make sure you continue to stay tuned to the feed at Party Jets Sports. Make sure you follow on Twitter or X at Party Jets Sports. On TikTok, we're continuing to put content out on TikTok. And then, of course, on YouTube. I'll see you next week. Until then, JTS.